How do you outsmart the smartest 1,000 times over with the same trick and walk away with their money? Let's start from the beginning. A senior man, aged 60, had just retired and had his life savings, equivalent to approximately $25,000. This honorable man decided to invest his savings, and a relative of his advised him to invest in a certain company. Unfortunately, that company turned out to be a scam, and the man lost all his money. Now, the question for everyone listening is, what do you think this man feels after losing his entire life savings? Sad, right? But how sad do you think he is? In your opinion, how does someone who loses all or most of their money feel? This question was explored by a professor at the Australian National University named Aaron Brown in a study he published in 2014 titled The Impact of Severe Financial Losses. In his research, Professor Brown conducted interviews with individual investors who lost their money in the collapse of the Australian financial advisory firm Storm Financial in March 2009. He aimed to study the impact of these losses on their mental and physical health. The conclusion of this study was that the psychological and physical effects experienced by individuals who suffer significant financial losses are quite similar to the effects a person feels when a loved one passes away. It is an intense grief that can severely deteriorate one's health. Of course, the degree of pain varies from person to person and culture to culture, but no one disputes that losing one's hard-earned savings is a sorrowful and pitiful thing. Anyone who loses their money in such a manner deserves sympathy, especially if they were the victim of a scam. However, not all of us react this way. Many people think that those who fall for scams are just foolish or greedy and deserve what happened to them because they didn't learn from similar scams that happen every day. But is this assumption accurate? No, and I'll explain why. The most infamous scam method in the world today is the Ponzi scheme, the concept of which is quite simple. Someone collects money from people, claiming they will invest it on their behalf in a project and promising fixed returns, usually very high. Of course, there is no project at all. The scammer starts paying the promised returns using the money he collected from the people themselves. This makes them happy and encourages them to invest more money and even bring in their acquaintances. The scammer keeps playing this game, robbing Peter to pay Paul, until the scam is exposed, and the money vanishes. This scam method has been going on for years and is repeated daily worldwide. Despite its simplicity and obviousness, it never burns out or ends. It will likely continue until the end of time. No matter how naive or silly it may seem, there's a reason for its persistence. Now, you might think you're too smart to fall for such an obvious scam, or that only fools fall into such traps. But this assumption is inaccurate. You could be an extremely intelligent and well-educated person, and yet a third grader could scam you and leave you in the lurch. How is this possible? Because intelligence is not the same as gullibility. To understand how this happens, we need to know how people get scammed in the first place, and that's what we'll discuss in today's episode. In February 2009, William Foxton, a retired British Army major, took his personal weapon, shot himself in the head, and died in his home in Southampton, UK. He committed suicide weeks after losing all his money, which he had invested with the infamous American scammer Bernard Madoff. Madoff was arrested in late 2008 after it was revealed that he had been running a massive Ponzi scheme worth $65 billion. Tragically, Major Foxton was not Madoff's only victim. There were thousands more. What made Madoff's scam particularly interesting, however, wasn't just its scale, but the profile of his victims. Using a relatively simple Ponzi scheme executed with remarkable sophistication, Madoff managed to scam some of the smartest minds in the world, including Wall Street tycoons who, given their intelligence, experience, and teams of financial analysts working for them, should have been the first to sniff out the scam from miles away. But they didn't. Madoff ran his Ponzi scheme from the 1980s until the FBI arrested him at his New York home in December 2008. This raises an important question. Were the hedge fund managers, high net worth investors, university professors, celebrities, and everyone else who invested with Madoff fools? Did none of them have an above-average IQ to realize he was a fraud? Were they all blinded by greed? The best person to answer this question is Stephen Greenspan, a professor of educational psychology at the University of Connecticut. Why is he the best person to answer? simply because, apart from his expertise in a field related to this topic, he was also one of Madoff's victims, losing about a third of his savings to the scam. In late December 2008, just days after Madoff's arrest, Greenspan published a brilliant book titled The Annals of Gullibility: Why We Get Duped and How to Avoid It. In this book, Greenspan explained how, despite being an intelligent, highly educated university professor with multiple doctorates, he was duped into falling for Madoff's obvious Ponzi scheme. Greenspan argued that the reason people are shocked when smart individuals fall for scams is that they don't understand the mechanisms of deception. Specifically, he identified 4 overlapping factors that influence why people fall for Ponzi schemes: situation, context, cognition, personality, and emotion. Let's break these down. Let's begin with the first factor: situation, context. Imagine a man named Ryan approaches you today and says, "I'm a businessman running a massive poultry business. My chickens lay eggs, the eggs hatch into chicks, and the chicks grow up to lay more eggs, and so on. I'm looking to expand this brilliant project into Muscovy ducks. What do you think about investing $50,000 with me? I'll give you 20% returns every month." At this point, there's a high chance you'd refuse, dismiss him as a scammer, and not believe a word he says. But when we introduce a mix of situational factors and social pressures into the equation, there's a significant chance you might believe him, regardless of how illogical his business model sounds. For instance, maybe some of your relatives have already invested money with Ryan and praise his intelligence, skill, and honesty. At the same time, he could be known in his community as a generous philanthropist with a spotless reputation. To add to that, you hear that a well-known, successful businessman, someone with a reputation for being savvy, has also invested with him. On top of all that, Ryan might have a selective investment policy, only accepting money from a limited group of people, making him seem exclusive and not desperate. In this context, you might let your guard down and suppress any doubts you have about his egg hatching business because the situational factors lead you to trust him. Outside of this context, if a random friend proposed the same idea with the same promised returns, you wouldn't hesitate to call him a scammer. At this point, someone might object, saying, "Come on, Ashraf. No context or factors will make me fall for such an obvious scam. Am I stupid to believe this nonsense?" This brings us to the second factor that plays a role in why people fall for Ponzi schemes: cognition or perception. Cognition and gullibility. Falling for a Ponzi scheme ultimately boils down to gullibility. Gullibility can be seen as a form of naivety, but that doesn't mean intelligent people are immune to it. In fact, when we look at the list of Madoff's victims, we find billionaires, investment experts, senators, doctors, university professors, and other individuals generally considered highly intelligent. Yet they acted with extreme naivety in this case. Their intelligence didn't protect them, or at least wasn't enough. What they needed was a higher level of awareness, not intelligence. And there's a big difference between the two. Canadian psychologist Keith Stanovich explains that intelligence refers to having cognitive schemas, mental frameworks, stored in your mind, essentially, knowledge. Awareness, on the other hand, is the practical application of that knowledge. Many highly intelligent individuals with an IQ of 201, for example, might still act naively in certain situations simply because they fail to use their intelligence effectively or actively. Why? For many reasons, but a major one is mental shortcuts or laziness. To make informed decisions about whether to invest your money with someone like Ryan, you'd need to put in significant mental effort to analyze, interpret, and understand all the data, numbers, and details surrounding the investment. This would allow you to reach a well-informed, conscious decision. However, many of us shy away from this kind of mental effort. Instead, we rely on shortcuts and cognitive heuristics. For example, you might hear that a reputable economist has invested his money with Ryan. Instead of doing your due diligence and carefully evaluating the investment opportunity Ryan is offering, you take the easy route. You tell yourself, if this well-known expert trusted Ryan and did his research, then Ryan must be the Warren Buffett of the Western world. There's no risk. Otherwise, the economist wouldn't have put his money there. In this case, You didn't analyze the situation or assess it critically. Instead, you relied on someone else's judgment, which is a big mistake. Why? Because the person you're relying on could be equally gullible or naive. Many people think of gullibility as simply trusting others too easily, believing that it's better to mistrust everyone and remain constantly skeptical. But is that true? To answer that, we need to discuss the third factor: personality. Personality and the role of trust. The nature of one's personality plays a significant role in whether they fall victim to scams. To start, we need to understand that all relationships in life are built on trust. For example, your relationship with a bank is based on trust. If you don't trust the bank to keep your money safe, you wouldn't deposit your funds there and sleep soundly at night. A basic level of trust is essential for any kind of interaction. As you know, people's personalities differ. Some people are extremely mistrustful and don't trust anyone at all. Others trust others, but only after they've provided proof or reassurance. And then there are those who are naturally inclined to trust others easily. When it comes to trust, people fall into three categories: right, center, and left. Both extremes, trusting too easily and trusting too little, are problematic. Ideally, you should be in the middle, especially when it comes to investments. Why? Let me explain. People who trust others too easily and believe them without clear justification expose themselves to the risk of misplaced trust, making them vulnerable to scams. Such individuals are often too shy or hesitant to say no, even when they notice red flags. They fall victim to confirmation bias, focusing only on information that supports their decision while ignoring anything that contradicts it. But is the solution to trust no one or to trust people only with extreme difficulty and skepticism? No. People who are overly skeptical and mistrusting also harm themselves. While this approach may reduce the likelihood of falling for scams, it also limits their interactions with others, reducing their exposure to the market and their opportunities to develop social intelligence. Social intelligence is the ability to read social cues and detect whether someone is trustworthy or not. By limiting their social exposure, overly skeptical people become socially inexperienced, making them less capable of recognizing scams when they encounter them. This brings us to the final factor: emotion. Emotion and its influence on decision-making. Do you know who the most successful investor is? This question wasn't asked by me, but by American neurologist and economist William J. Bernstein. He said that the most successful investor is someone who doesn't let emotions influence their investment decisions. According to Bernstein, emotional people are generally terrible investors. Emotions always interfere with investments, and two emotions, in particular, dominate financial decisions: fear and greed. Fear and greed in investment decisions. Many scammers, particularly those running Ponzi schemes, deliberately put their victims under time pressure. They emphasize the idea that the proposed investment opportunity is a once-in-a-lifetime chance that must be seized quickly before it disappears. Under this pressure, fear takes over, specifically, the fear of missing out, FOMO. You rush to make a decision and jump on the opportunity, fearing you'll regret not acting fast enough if you miss it. On the other hand, when scammers promise extraordinarily high returns, greed comes into play. There's a popular English saying, "If it sounds too good to be true, it probably is." In simple terms, if something seems too perfect to be real, it probably isn't. Despite this, many people, driven by greed, suppress their doubts, close their minds, and focus solely on the lucrative returns promised to them. Picture someone who's just handed $10,000 to a scammer. They start doing mental math, telling themselves, "He promised me 20% monthly returns, so I'll get $2,000 every month. In just 5 months, I'll have made back my initial capital." These are dreams and fantasies. The reality is that the scammer can vanish in the blink of an eye, leaving you empty-handed. This is because Ponzi schemes, no matter how long they last, only have two possible endings. 1. The scammer gets exposed and arrested. 2. The scammer decides to cut and run, taking the money and disappearing. Your greed and fear were key factors in your falling for the trap. This is where having a sense of cold cognition can be extremely helpful. Cold cognition versus hot cognition. Cold cognition refers to thinking, reasoning, and decision-making processes that are free from emotional influence. It's the ability to assess situations and make judgments logically and rationally, without letting emotions cloud your judgment. The opposite of cold cognition is hot cognition, which is thinking and decision-making driven by emotional impulses. For the reasons mentioned earlier, Ponzi schemes will continue to exist and ensnare victims, no matter how obvious or foolish they seem. There are, of course, some scams that are laughably easy to spot because they're based on bizarre or illogical business models. However, other scams are much harder to detect because they're built on legitimate-sounding business ventures. Why Ponzi schemes persist? This type of scam exists worldwide, but is especially prevalent in countries with limited investment options. In such places, people lack access to sufficient financial instruments to invest their money safely, making them more vulnerable to scammers. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to see more, please subscribe to the channel and stay tuned for upcoming episodes.